Good evening and welcome to the Savannah Council on World Affairs for our July presentation entitled In the Shadow of the Bear, Defense Policies of East Central European Countries and the Russian Challenge, presented by the Savannah Council on World Affairs board member, Dr. Jacek Lubecki. My name is Jim Van Epps. I'm a council board member as well as a member of the Programs Committee. And I'll be your host for this program, our third virtual presentation, which is part of our effort to stay in touch with our membership and Savannah neighbors during this difficult time. Before I turn the lectern over to Dr. Lubecki, I'd like to thank you, our friends, members, and sponsors for your continued support. Because of you, we can bring you these programs and again provide scholarships for students of both Georgia Southern and Savannah State universities. I want to especially thank Kreitz Auto Group, which has kindly agreed to be our platinum sponsor for 2020-21. But I'd also like to thank our in-kind sponsors, which you'll see on this slide. They include Planters Inn, Four Season Travel, the Learning Center of Senior Citizens, Inc., Barnes Catering, Pod on the Go, Tell Your Story, Reach the World, bringing the world into classrooms. These sponsors offer the Savannah Council free or heavily discounted services which enable us to assist speakers with quality travel and lodging. They provide audio and video recordings of our presentations to members. They host our board meetings, provide catering at our annual fundraiser, and enable our university scholarship students to dialogue with Savannah School students. We're grateful for the support of all our sponsors. And I also want to thank the Skidaway Island Presbyterian Church for their use of our sanctuary, as well as Roger Smith and Debbie Hornsby for their technical help in providing or in producing this video. Now, Dr. Lubecki is Assistant Professor of Political Science and International Studies at Georgia Southern University. He was born in Poland, where he earned a Bachelor of Arts equivalent in law and the Romance languages. He earned his PhD in International Studies at the University of Denver, and he taught in 3 universities before coming to his present position at Georgia Southern in 2012. He's an expert on East and East Central European and Middle Eastern politics, terrorism, counterinsurgency, and global issues. He speaks 8 languages. His new book is Defense Politics of East Central European Countries After 1989, Creating Stability in a Time of Uncertainty. His other publications include Echoes of Latifundism, Poland and Iraq, and Reconstructing Galicia, among others. Tonight, Jacek will lead us through, in his presentation, NATO's Frontier in the Shadow of the Bear, the history of East Central Europe between 2 world wars and during the Cold War, the region's turn to liberalism and NATO in the years 1989 to 1999, NATO's expansion and war on terror in the years 1999 to 2014, a resurgent Russia, President Trump, and nationalist populism, all leading to the question, whither East Central Europe, in 3 scenarios. I'm looking forward to a very interesting presentation, and after Jacek's talk and questions from our members, I'll close with a reminder of our future speakers, as well as World Affairs Council of America's offerings. Now it's my honor to welcome and to present Dr. Jacek Lubecki.
Good afternoon. I'm really happy to be here in front of my dear audience at the Savannah Council of World Affairs. And thank you so much for a graceful introduction. Again, really happy to be here. I appreciate a plentiful audience present here. So I'm going to talk about defense policies of East Central European countries. And the title of my presentation is In the Shadow of the Bear. So obviously we're going to talk about the bear and who the bear is, and so on and so forth. But briefly, first, I will introduce my topic. Then I will talk about the historical background, which is, I'm not going to go back centuries. We will talk about the 20th century, East Central Europe before World War I and before World War II, during the Cold War and more recently. So part of that history is the expansion of NATO, North Atlantic Alliance, into East Central Europe, and we will talk about it briefly. And then we will talk about Russia, right? So obviously, the discussion of East Central European defense policies is in the broader context of what's perceived to be a resurgence of Russia under President Putin and the war in Ukraine, obviously the Trump presidency in the United States. And we will finish up talking about the current shape of defense policies in East Central Europe and perhaps speculate about the future of those policies. So by the way, I've been gracefully introduced. I just recently, together with my colleague Jim Peterson, who is retired chair of Polka Science Department at Valdosta State University, he and I authored a book of, actually the initial title was In the Shadow of the Bear, ended up being Defense Policies of East Central European Countries. But precisely the topic of my talk today, so I invite you to read the book. I will mention it again at the end of the talk. So let's start our discussion. All right, so obviously the bear is our topic, so let's first talk about the bear. So the bear is the biggest land predator on Earth, even though there are some doubts about it. Bears being scavengers rather than predators. And as you perhaps know, the panda is is in a bear family, and it's actually exclusively a vegetarian. So first of all, I wanted to clear up some misconceptions about the bears. Not all of them are carnivores and predators. There are all kinds of bears. You have polar bears, you have brown bears, you have panda bears in nature. All right. And obviously you have metaphorical and human-created bears. And there you have famously Yogi Bear, Cindy Bear, Teddy Bear. You have Goldilocks and Three Bears. That was originally 3 bears, not 7 bears. And you have no shortage of books entitled In the Shadow of the Bear. I counted at least 8. In other words, bear is one of the most overused metaphors and mythological figures in human popular culture. So I apologize for making my title so boring. Now, obviously, the bear in title of my talk is not Cindy Bear or a Teddy Bear. It's the Russian bear. And again, this is one of the most overused metaphors in history. Everybody uses the metaphor of the bear when referring to Russia. So, by the way, the picture of Putin that you see obviously is photoshopped. Actual original picture has Putin riding a horse. So the Russians photoshopped a bear, naturally. By the way, there's no end of jokes in Russia about the metaphor. There's kind of love-hate relationship with the bear in Russia because on the one hand, Russians actually like the metaphor. The bear is powerful and when angry, dangerous. And that's not the type of metaphor they wouldn't necessarily like. On the other hand, the Russians are deeply aware that everybody is using the godforsaken metaphor of the bear all the time about them. And, a favorite joke about Americans in Russia is that Americans think that if you go to Russia, you see bears walking on the streets or, bears are favorite pets in Russia. And that's obviously not the case. Now, politically, representing Russia as a bear is also a very old metaphor. You see on the slides, it's an old cartoon from the Punch magazine, 1907, after England, which was represented as a lion, made a deal with Russia over control of Persia. That's the cartoon that appeared in Punch, and it shows the Russian bear sitting on the tail of the Persian cat, and therefore cornering Russian sphere of influence in Iran, at the time called Persia. And the hegemonic party in Russia, so Putin's party of power, Yedinaya Rossiya, One Russia, or it's called the Unity Party in Russia, uses the bear as a logo. So clearly Russians are not adverse to using this whole bear metaphor. So yes, the titular bear is the Russian bear, and the countries of East Central Europe live in the shadow of the bear. And the bear defines their foreign policy and defense policy, but in complex types of ways. So one of the things I will argue in my talk, and that's really a big topic of the book I recently co-wrote with Jim Peterson, is that looking at East Central Europe exclusively from the vantage point of the Russian threat is outdated for at least one group of those countries. In other words, East Central Europe is no longer the shadow of the bear. It has become bifurcated into two groups of countries, and one group of countries which is deeply afraid of Russia and therefore gears their defense policies towards the Russian threat, and the other group of countries that doesn't care, and their defense policies are defined differently. That shadow of the bear metaphor works only up to a point. So what you see here on the map is the most important countries in my talk. Now, by the way, a couple of technicalities. East Central Europe, historically, narrowly speaking, sometimes includes Germany, definitely Poland, definitely the Czech Republic and Slovakia, or what used to be Czechoslovakia, and the country of Hungary. Right? That's the narrow definition of East Central Europe, which, by the way, I used, Jim Peterson and myself used in our book. Just those four countries. By the way, another term used for those countries today is Visegrad 4. So Visegrad is a alliance, is a treaty relationship that was signed in the Slovak city of Visegrad in 1990 that created a partnership between those four countries. So Visegrad 4 is another term for East Central Europe, narrowly conceived. But you can also use the term in kind of broader terms to designate all of the countries that are between what used to be called or still is called Western Europe and Russia, and countries that used to belong to the Soviet Union. And the precise boundaries are kind of ambiguous in this respect. So, for instance, it wouldn't be wrong to include Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania into that grouping of countries. And by the way, they have their own term. They're called Baltic countries. They're countries bordering the Baltic Sea. They have lots of commonality between them, and they have lots of commonality with Poland, Czech Republic, Slovakia, and Hungary. And I'm going to talk about it. Then you have Romania and Bulgaria. So technically, that's Eastern Balkan countries. And again, those are countries in between what traditionally is called Western Europe and Russia. And then you have the whole area of the former Yugoslavia that at this point includes 8 countries that are successor countries of what used to be the Republic of Yugoslavia. And then you have also the country of Albania. And again, Greece, even though it is in that region, is typically not included into this grouping of countries because it wasn't a communist or Soviet-dominated country during the Cold War, most importantly. And Turkey has some geographical presence in that area. A slice of Turkey, Thrace, is in the European zone of the Balkans, but typically Turkey is conceived as a Middle Eastern country. So all of those former Soviet bloc countries are of interest when we talk about the region, and I will talk about all of them with the emphasis, though, on the 4 core countries of East Central Europe, the Visegrad 4, Poland, Czech Republic, Slovakia, and Hungary. Okay, what you see on the map is the percentage of GDP that countries in the region spend on defense, with a special emphasis of the countries that spend at 2% or above, which is the NATO recommended level of national spending on defense. And it's very conspicuous on the map that countries that actually do spend at this level, so therefore take defense seriously are the three Baltic countries, so Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania, and Poland, and then Romania and Bulgaria, right? And by the way, Greece, which again does not belong to the region, also has pretty high level of military spending. So in many ways, my presentation is to explain what's going on, right? So why is it that some countries in East Central Europe take their defense seriously and are engaging in serious efforts to upgrade their military defenses, and other countries apparently don't? And naturally, what explains it is the perception of the Russian threat. Right? So this is where the shadow of the bear becomes important. So let's talk about what created this reality, which, by the way, has many dimensions, and we will talk about it some more. So number one, history. Right. So number one, the interwar period, which is the period between World War I and World War II. So this is when the region in question emerged as more or less in a similar shape, to some extent at least, to what we have today, which is independent nation states of East Central Europe emerged from the wreck of the Ottoman, Russian, Austro-Hungarian, and German empires. No, the boundaries were different, and some of the states were different. But this is the beginning of this geopolitical reality that we call East Central Europe. And a couple of characteristics of that period in this respect. So you can see Poland was extended much more to the east than it is today, occupying the territories of what's today parts of Lithuania, Belarus, and Ukraine. And by the way, Poland won those territories in a war against the Soviet Union between 1919 and 1920. Poland also took parts of German territory in central Pomerania and what's called Greater Poland, which is the region. The German name of the city is Posen, Polish is Poznań. So anyway, Poland expanded at the expense of historical Russia or Russian Empire and historical Germany. And generally, Poland did not exist before World War I. So right away, the creation of the Polish state created the hostility of Poland's neighbors to the east and west. And that's going to be the reality that will define Poland's fate in World War II. Then the Baltic countries emerged. The tiny nations of Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania took advantage of the breakdown of the Russian Empire to create their own nation states. And they stood up to both white Russians and the communist Russia. By the way, given some support by the British Navy and German troops also, the Baltics were able to create their own nation states. Czechoslovakia emerged as a completely new country from the Czech and Slovak people, Slavic people getting together, and they took parts of both Austrian and the Hungarian parts of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. In the meantime, and you see the little map on the other side of the slide, Hungary, historical kingdom of Hungary, was cut to size, and parts of Hungary went to the kingdom of Yugoslavia, to Romania, and to Czechoslovakia. By the way, Hungary was the biggest territorial loser in the whole reshuffling of boundaries after World War I. So that created a potential major spot of hostility. One of the realities of East Central Europe was an alliance between Yugoslavia, Romania, and Czechoslovakia. It was called the Little Entente. And the purpose of that alliance was to contain Hungary. And Hungary was resentful, revisionist, and aggressive power during this interwar period. Then we have Bulgaria that was actually also defeated in World War I and lost territory to Yugoslavia and to Romania. And obviously, Greece was there, and Turkey survived World War I. But anyway, you had this complex geopolitical reality that emerged from World War I. So one of the characteristics of that period and that region was hostility, both within those newly created countries that included national minorities. Yugoslavia was famously multinational, and hostility between those countries. Poland took parts of Lithuania, when the Polish national state was created. Lithuanians living in Lithuania had a very hostile relationship with Poland during the interwar period. Czechoslovakia and Poland fought border wars among each other. There was this constant hostility between Hungary and its neighbors. So Hungary and Czechoslovakia, Hungary and Romania, and Hungary and Yugoslavia. And then Bulgaria was also a resentful revisionist power. So conflict, there was always a possibility of conflict between those countries. The presence of resentful Germany and this new power of the Soviet Union was a constant source of potential tension in the area. And then France and Great Britain tried to maintain hegemony in the entire European continent, but it was shaky and weakening, especially as the Soviet and German power started reviving. So that was an uneasy, realist world of hostility. And World War II came out of this. And let's move to the next slide. And the World War II resulted in yet another reality, which is very well known to us, and that's the Cold War and division of continent between Western blocs and Eastern blocs. And part of the Soviet conquest and subjugation of East Central Europe was some changes in boundaries. Hungary was defeated. Hungary was a major ally of Germany in World War II and was defeated and restored to pre-World War II boundaries. And then countries of the region were made communist, but that's important to remember. Only some of them were communist and part of the Soviet bloc. The two communist countries of Western Balkans, which is Yugoslavia and Albania, actually were independent communist countries, and one of the Soviet bloc countries, and that's Romania, asserted its independence during the Cold War. It remained communist, but independent to an extent in its foreign policy from the Soviet Union. So by the way, if you think about it, the whole Balkans became something like a geopolitical nightmare for both the Western Bloc and the Eastern Bloc. There were so many loose ends and wild cards in that equation that both NATO and Warsaw Pact started de-emphasizing the Balkans in their geopolitical calculations. The main clash was supposed to happen in Central Europe, Poland, Czechoslovakia, East Germany, West Germany were kind of the main axis of the clash. And that's where both the Soviets and the Americans put their chief military resources and strategic planning. And we know that the Cold War ended without bloodshed. It ended up with the collapse of the Soviet Union. Let's move on with the slides. Not just collapse of the Soviet Union, the collapse of the entire Soviet state. Russia was pushed back to the boundaries it used to have in 17th century. It lost Ukraine. It lost influence in East Central Europe. But by the way, one remnant of World War II and the Cold War that remained is the Kaliningrad Oblast. And you see the little red dot on the map. And that's a Russian enclave, which is sandwiched between Lithuania and Poland and the Baltic Sea to the west. So Russia actually has no land connection to the Kaliningrad Oblast, kind of major geopolitical spot of tension. And countries of East Central Europe emerged independent, democratic, and capitalist from the reshuffling. Let's move on. Okay. In 1991, 1989, it was not known what will become of those former communist countries in terms of defense policies and geopolitical alignment. When the Cold War was ending, there was actually lots of talk about dissolving both NATO and the Warsaw Pact and changing the entire security architecture of Europe to make it into a multilateral system of collective security, including both Russia and the West. Promises to that extent were made to Russians when the Cold War founded. There's some debate about it, but the newest research showed without doubt that informally United States promised to the Soviet Union that NATO will not expand into former Soviet bloc countries in East Central Europe. To the contrary, there was all this talk about replacing NATO and Warsaw Pact with some type of all-European security architecture centered on organizations of security, OSCE in Europe. Nevertheless, NATO expanded, right? So it's a fascinating story told in several books about how the decision to expand NATO was made. And it was both push and pull factor. Very quickly, by early 1990s, security experts in Germany and the United States mostly realized that leaving East Central Europe in this kind of neutral security vacuum, it's not the wisest policy for the West. So there were some bureaucratic actors and experts that was pushing towards it. But most importantly, those countries became sovereign, countries of East Central Europe, and they didn't care about the promise made by the United States to Russia informally. They made their own internal determination, democratic determination, to become members of the most successful security alliance that ever existed, which is NATO. And the decision was not just based on pure military security considerations, because those countries were actually fairly secure, at least externally at the time. Russia was weak, and there was no potential external threat to those countries. But being a part of the West for those former communist countries involved joining Western military and non-military institutions, and NATO was a symbol of it. So again, it's not just about military security, because there was actually a weak attention to military security issues. So NATO expanded. Czech Republic, Hungary, and Poland, 1999. That was under President Clinton. Then 2004, Bulgaria, Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania. Romania, Slovakia, and Slovenia is under George W. Bush. We had the biggest expansion of NATO territorially. And then 2009, Albania and Croatia, so that's President Obama, and then Montenegro under President Trump, 2017. Let's move on. So by the way, the best book, I'm going to remind you about it, is by James Goldgeier, Not Whether and When, the US decision to expand NATO. And he talks not just about United States, but all of the actors in the drama. Obviously, on the Russian side, it was mercurial President Yeltsin who presided over the whole drama. And President Clinton had this personal relationship with Yeltsin that kind of sweetened the deal. Russia was opposed deep down to expansion of NATO, but could do little about it. It was too weak. And it was outmaneuvered by the United States and East Central European countries. Famously, President Wałęsa of Poland in early 1990s managed to get Yeltsin drunk and then make a declaration that Russia has no objections to Poland joining NATO. No, that declaration was later rescinded, but what was said, and that's one of the interesting stories of the NATO expansion. So again, by 1999, and you see the chief executives of the three admitted countries, Poland, the Czech Republic, and Hungary, and then President Clinton presiding over the moment of admission of those three countries into NATO. Let's move on. All right, and as soon as those countries were admitted to NATO, 9/11 happened, and the Western Alliance was mired into the controversy and military issues involved in the war on terror. So number one, invasion of Afghanistan, and then the endless war in Afghanistan, which continues to this day. And then the invasion of Iraq in 2003. So a couple of things that came with it. Newly admitted NATO members were all keen to prove their loyalty to the United States and their importance as security actors in the Western Alliance. So all of them tried to contribute both to the Iraqi operation, which was a pretty much unilateral operation by the United States and coalition of the willing. And then the operation in Afghanistan, which was a NATO operation in turn, where NATO pledged to be involved institutionally in the whole action. So by the way, so you see Polish troops in Afghanistan, a picture very prominent. Poland suffered major casualties, and Polish involvement in operations in Afghanistan was very combat-oriented and fairly strong. But what you see below, I'm not sure if you can guess the flag, that's Georgia, right? And not Georgia, well, Georgia, the country. By some numbers, in proportion to its GDP and population, Georgia was the most important US ally in the war on terror. Both operations in Afghanistan and Iraq, but especially in Iraq. So good question is why Georgia? And we're going to go back to it, even though Georgia is kind of not precisely in the region that we talk about. And the second dimension of those countries' membership in NATO is military spending. So by the way, if you look at the chart on the slide, military spending dramatically declined after the end of the Cold War, East and West. So it's clearly declined in Central and Eastern Europe. But once it declined, it stayed at a pretty consistent level or even increased as you look at the time when those countries were joining NATO and then the beginning of the war on terror, right? So the countries were actually trying to prove their commitment to the Western Alliance and self-defense and participation in the Western Alliance. And then those deployments, some of them were pretty costly. For instance, the Polish deployment in Afghanistan was costly to the Polish taxpayer because it was funded, as a NATO operation, was funded by the Poles. By the way, the deployment in Iraq obviously cost in lives, but the cost of Polish deployment in Iraq was paid by the United States, right? It was kind of part of this coalition of the willing picture. Let's move on. All right, so this is the chart that really, I think, or table that illustrates what I have in mind. What we have here is ranking of the countries in question, so former communist countries, countries of the former Soviet bloc or former Soviet countries, in terms of the level of their commitment to US or NATO-led operations in the war on terror. So number one is Georgia. Number two is Poland. Then we have Estonia, Croatia, Romania, Macedonia, Lithuania, Latvia, and then far below, Hungary and Bulgaria. So by the way, here we go. Georgia, Poland, the three Baltic countries, and Romania are all there, right? So what is it that those countries, and by the way, Croatia, which is kind of a separate story. Croatia is a former Yugoslav country in the Balkans. All of those countries have residual or current security concerns about Russia, right? So even in that period of the war on terror, we can clearly see that what determined their will to contribute to operations that had nothing to do with Russia per se is their desire to show their loyalty to the United States and level of support to the United States. And clearly that's motivated by concern about Russia. We want to be loyal to elicit loyalty in return in case of conflict with Russia. And by the way, that was illustrated dramatically in case of Georgia, because 3,000 strong brigade of Georgian troops in Iraq were airlifted in August 2008 directly, by the way, by US Air Force, directly to Georgia to fight Russia in the August 2008 war. United States famously supported Georgia in that war diplomatically and politically, but not militarily. But this is what Georgia was hoping for, clearly. Let's move on. So already before the Ukrainian crisis, the Crimean crisis, and the current issue of resurgent Russia, we could see that there are two different categories of countries emerging in Eastern Europe. One, countries that are, I would call frontier countries, countries with major historically and geopolitically defined issues with Russia. And the second group of countries, much less concerned about Russia. By the way, if I showed you a table of military spending of those two groups of countries, they couldn't be more different. right? In countries like Slovakia, Czech Republic, Hungary, what we saw is a pattern of major decline in military spending to below 1% of GDP, right? So in Hungary, the general consensus was that Hungary is essentially getting rid of its military forces, maintaining residual kind of token military force and military spending, not capable even of defending Hungary, but kept for the sake of appearance of participation in NATO and military alliance with the United States. In the meantime, Poland, what we had is robust spending, by the way, throughout this whole period, at the level of 2% or more of GDP. And that involved not just the cost of operations in Iraq and Afghanistan, but major efforts at military procurement. And then after the Crimean takeover and the war in Ukraine, actually a major buildup and beefing up of defense spending, clearly in reaction to the perceived Russian threat. So two different groups of countries emerged in East Central Europe. Let's move on. So back again, Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania, all of those countries since 2014 and 15 engaged in dramatic and accelerated military buildup. Also in those countries, we had NATO troops being deployed as a potential deterrent force. And by the way, that was under President Obama. And those deployments and operations continued under President Trump, which, by the way, I'm sure questions about President Trump are going to arise. So with Trump presidency, on the issues in question, what you have is this schizophrenic, dramatic difference between the policies and the talk. If we move on slides. So famously, President Trump has this bromance with Putin. You see the cartoon to this extent. There's also this whole notion that United States is carrying this unfair share of defense burden with respect to NATO, and each country in NATO should live up to its recommended commitment of 2% of military spending. In East Central Europe, the frontier countries that I mentioned don't have to be reminded about the 2% threshold. They've already been spending the 2% before President Trump's prompting. And that's clearly motivated by security concerns about Russia. The other countries couldn't care less. They don't have security concerns about Russia. They see themselves as largely safe. They have other policy priorities. And the 2% is just a recommendation anyway. It's not some type of mandatory level of spending. By the way, if you kind of wonder what's the real motivation for this appeal, well, increases in military spending in those countries are likely to be spent on purchases of, among others, American military equipment. That has definitely been the case in countries like Poland and Romania that procured, major new weapon systems from the United States. The F-35s, famously in Poland, that arguably Poland doesn't need and cannot operate. So it's a political, just as much as military gesture towards the United States and towards President Trump, that again is a sign of Polish loyalty and bilateral commitment to this relationship with the United States, no matter who is in charge, right? In the meantime, and again, you see the chart on the slide, military spending in most countries of the region increased, kind of residually. But overall, the high spenders remain high spenders and the low spenders remain low spenders. And again, that's defined by their perception of, looks like the Russian threat. Okay, let's move on. Question, what will the future look like? So number one, I hope that I illustrated to you a couple of things about East Central Europe And number one is there are two groups of countries in East Central Europe. One, frontier countries concerned about Russia for all kinds of historical and geopolitical reasons. And those countries' strategic position has not changed. And they have been high spenders and countries concerned about their security for decades, regardless of who is in charge in the United States, who is in charge in Russia, and who is in charge of those countries. So that is going to continue. What seems to be a variable is US policy. But is it really? So obviously, with President Trump, you have a set of kind of very bizarre pronouncements regarding durability of NATO, US commitment to European security. So that's talk. In terms of policy, traditional US security policies by and large continued because they are bureaucratized and institutionalized. So we are facing presidential elections this year. Who knows who's going to be president after this year? But if we think that, let's say, with President Biden, we're going to return to the status quo ante, number one caveat is, has it really changed under President Trump, at least on the real institutional level, as contrary to rhetoric? Right? There was definitely turbulence, but you had those continuities of the policy, both with regard to the United States and with regard to East Central Europe. Now, by the way, to the extent that President Trump talked about lessening US security commitment to Europe, well, that began under George W. Bush and continued under Obama with pivot to Asia. So again, while the terminology and the rhetoric of President Trump is unique, the policies are not. Right? Just the salesmanship behind them is a little bit different. So return to status quo, but what is it? Is kind of a good question. So I put a question mark here. So B, Europeanization of European security policies. The United States, no matter who is in charge, is likely to diminish its security commitment to Europe. And I think the results of COVID-19 crisis and the fiscal mess we have are only going to reinforce that. What will happen? NATO stands on US participation. Will it mean that NATO will become mostly a European organization or will be replaced by more Europe-oriented type of structures of security? Is kind of an open question. And you have some interesting developments in this respect. Hungary is an interesting one if you look at it. So Hungarian president famously is a nationalist populist, asserts Hungary's sovereignty. It's a weak country. By the way, for most of his rule, he neglected Hungarian military spending. Recently, he started spending a lot, actually, trying to beef up Hungarian military forces. All of the equipment he's buying is not from the United States, but from Europe. Right? So contrary to Poland, let's say, he's actually orienting Hungarian security policy towards a European-style solution. Perhaps seeing the decline of US security commitment to Europe as kind of a given. It's going to happen no matter what, no matter who's in charge, because it has continued for the last 2 decades. And then possibly the worst case scenario, if NATO falls apart and European solution does not emerge, there will be a return to realism. So kind of loose system of free security interaction between countries in Europe. And that's more or less return to interwar period. And number one, Russian power would grow. So by the way, this is what Russia wants. That's as pronounced by President Putin. He wants the return of kind of traditional great power politics, whereby great powers would decide in deals with each other the fate of the world. And at least based on what President Trump says, this is what he wants. Kind of robust national realist policy that would allow United States to simply assert its unilateral advantage. And by the way, from East Central European point of view, that's kind of the worst case scenario, because that's what East Central Europe was between World War I and World War II. It was kind of free-for-all realist world, and sandwiched between two great powers of Germany and the Soviet Union, and then hostile to each other. East Central European countries self-destroyed, or their sovereignty was destroyed in the shuffle. So they shouldn't want it. And okay, here's the final note, but more and more leaders of those countries at least project the notion that this is what they want. Was the whole nationalist populist upsurge. They talk about countries pursuing kind of robustly unilateral realist policies aimed at national power and national advantage. And you know, based on historical experience, that would be disastrous to the countries of the region. But nevertheless, the projection remains. So let me just kind of leave it open. Thank you so much. And I'm open to questions.
Thank you, Jacek. Well done. We do have a couple of questions that came in advance of your presentation, so let's go to the first. What's your prediction about President Trump either continuing in office or being replaced by former Vice President Biden? And how would that influence the security situation in East Central Europe?
Well, thank you so much. Thank you for your thanks and this wonderful question, Jim. So if President Trump continues in office, one of the things I said is there's this strange bifurcation between policies and rhetoric, that on the institutional level, in terms of kind of routine functioning, NATO continues to reassure its East Central European members, build up, deter Russia, and so on and so forth. So there's this strange separation between kind of pro-Russian, friendly to Russia rhetoric of President Trump and actual policies pursued in Europe. So the rhetoric seems to have no effect, or little effect, at least on the kind of level of basic reality on NATO's position in East Central Europe. So I wonder if President Trump continues in his second term, at some point there wouldn't be a policy consequence of the rhetoric. So sooner or later, the institutions of NATO will erode in absence of both, kind of the verbal commitment to NATO and most likely fiscal consequences of the COVID crisis and so on and so forth. United States will turn even more inward as the consequence of everything that happened in this respect. So we might see accelerated erosion of NATO if NATO means US commitment to security of Europe. So we would more likely move towards either general erosion of security architecture of Europe and therefore assertion of Russian power as a consequence of that, or a move towards a European solution. Now, whether it will happen or not, that's an open question. President Macron of France is talking about a new security architecture in Europe centered on European Union rather than NATO. Now, will it happen? It's unlikely to happen in absence of German commitment. And Germany is focused inward also. Famously, German military spending is low. German military is demoralized, actually. If you read the accounts of the effects of this continuous austerity on the German military, it's diminishing. So Germany is not a major security actor, and it's unwilling to be one, looks like. And in absence of German commitment, France itself is unlikely to carry the burden of creating the new security architecture in Europe. So then we're talking about the erosion and unknown consequences in this respect. Now, by the way, if President Biden comes to power, former Vice President Biden, then we are likely to see rhetorically much greater commitment to traditional US policies in Europe. How much will it translate into reality remains a question, because President Biden would be still facing the same fiscal realities as President Trump would be. And again, the kind of devolving and withdrawal of United States from Europe preceded President Trump. So this is where we kind of have to be aware of the rhetoric on the one hand and the realities on the other. Thank you.
Good, thank you. We do have a second question, and that is, how will internal politics in East Central Europe affect the future of defense policies in the entire region?
So in East Central Europe, by now, across the board, we see a shift towards nationalist populism. It used to be that, well, it's just Hungary and their strange president, and then Poland. But by now, such kind of established liberal countries as the Czech Republic, Slovakia, Croatia, all of them are experiencing the turn towards nationalist populism. And that turn means there the same thing that it means here, which is assertion of the country's independent policy, a certain level of disdain towards international institutions, sometimes hostile rhetoric towards minorities or neighboring countries. So the type of policies that erode any established international institutions. No, just like here, one wonders about the real effect of this rhetoric. Is it just rhetoric, or does it have real relevance towards policies? But on balance, the forces, internal domestic political forces in East Central Europe and kind of across the board are pushing those countries towards lesser commitment to institutions like NATO, even with the increased spending, right? Like for Poland, that increased military spending is often geared towards asserting a bilateral security relationship with the United States rather than commitment to NATO as an institution. So here is what's going on. But again, there's a distinction between rhetoric and reality, which is kind of to be watched.
Thank you. And we do have time for one last question, and that is, where is Lech Walesa of Poland in this entire situation? Is he still politically relevant?
So it's a very good question. And as far as I know, for most people, there are two people associated with recent history of Poland, and that's Pope John Paul II and Lech Walesa. And that's pretty much it. You know, historically, I'm not sure if people know about Marie Curie or Chopin, but those two people kind of represent the Polish brand, and Lech Walesa especially, with his historical role in the fall of communism. So it's an interesting story how he remains popular and known abroad, but in Poland, he completely faded away as a political figure, even though he's still alive. No, he was very much popular and powerful. When Poland moved to democracy, he became the first democratically elected president of Poland since 1923, so modern Poland. And then famously, he lost his presidential bid in 1995 to a former communist candidate in very narrow elections. So he was still very popular in 1995, just lost it by a bit. And then he returned to run again in 2000. And at that point, he got 2% of votes. So clearly he faded in those 5 years in between. And by the way, good question is what happened. So he's a political maverick of the nationalist populist type a little bit. Famously, he never created a real political party. His was supposed to be a single person show. He portrayed himself as somebody who stays beyond and above party divisions. And he couldn't even create a cabinet or a group of people dedicated to him. So his failure was institutional and bureaucratic. So with no machine, his presidential bid in 2000 just fizzled out with kind of humiliating defeat. And then he started fading, but he was still a senior statesman, kind of respected and so on and so forth. So what came out in 2000s, research by several historians, Polish secret police archives were opened. And at this point, it's pretty much without doubt that Lech Wałęsa, to some extent at least, cooperated with the communist secret services in early 1970s. So, by the way, obviously, initially that was seen as simply a political smear or a part of communist disinformation campaign. I mean, who knows about the archives and it was planted there. But by now, the consensus of historians is that was the case pretty much. So, by the way, by the time of 1980 strikes and the martial law and so on and so forth, there's no evidence that he was an agent, right? But that kind of stain on his personal history remains. And by the way, that leads to another debate, which is how much it matters or doesn't, given historical role. Inevitably, though, that he diminished his standing in kind of Polish hierarchy of political authority. So he remains, by the way, a senior political figure. He speaks. He's in opposition to current government of Poland, and is appropriately, vilified in return. It's kind of a good question how he will be seen in political history of Poland, but currently doesn't seem like he has much influence in terms of internal debates. New people replaced him on the scene. People largely unknown in the West, by the way, by and large.
Well, again, thank you, Jacek, for your interesting, thought-provoking presentation.
Thank you so much.
We are grateful and fortunate for your being with us this evening. We'll see you again soon, and we wish you a good evening.
Thank you so much. Really nice to be here. Thank you.
A few remarks as we wrap up. Despite our current circumstances, it's important that we continue to further the mission of the Savannah Council on World Affairs by fostering individual awareness of, broadening community involvement in, and promoting the study of international affairs. Toward that end, I want to make sure that our members are aware that we have a full slate of presentations already lined up for the fall, which you can see at our website at savannahcwa.org. Our 3 spring speakers who were forced to cancel due to the pandemic have agreed to come to Savannah in the fall. And in addition, Dr. Matthew Kronig will return to Savannah in October to speak to our members. His current book is The Return of Great Power Rivalry. In the meantime, please continue to follow Savannah Council developments on our website and our Facebook page. We will continue to send you blast emails with timely information, including the many presentations and podcasts facilitated by the World Affairs Council of America, as well as our sister councils across the country, which have been so active during this pandemic. Thank you again for joining the Savannah Council on World Affairs for Dr. Jacek Lubecki's presentation this evening, In the Shadow of the Bear. Please contact us with any comments, thoughts, questions, suggestions. We'll see you next time. In the meantime, stay healthy and good night.